Hi, everybody. Welcome to Sunday night Murder of Dukes / Sisters interview. I'm Ashaksi, and this is my sister, Sir Rifkin.
Hi.
On here, and we are very excited tonight to have Duke Henrik of Havn with us. And we usually start these interviews off with asking about your SCA origin story. How did you find out about the SCA, and how did you get started?
Well, I didn't find out about the SCA. I found out about a party that was going to be held in Berkeley on May 1st, 1966, that people were invited to come in costumes of whatever nature they felt was appropriate, and were representing cultures where swords were worn. And that piqued my interest. I was going to San Francisco State at the time, and I was living in one of the residence halls there, and a couple of fellow students that I had met prior to seeing the notice for the first tournament, or party actually. We had bonded due to common interest in science fiction and fantasy literature, and they had joined a Bay Area science fiction club that they invited me to join. And so I went to a couple of the club meetings and was interested in further participation. And one day I stopped off at their room to meet them to go to dinner. And I saw this poster on the wall, which was the invitation to the first event, and said, "Hey, this sounds fun. Can I go?" And they said, "Sure, come on along." And that was the beginning. So I showed up at the event, and I had some personal prehistory in that I'd made a sword a couple of years before that, just for the heck of it. And I had made a tabard while I was in high school out of some monk's cloth panels that I found in an old screen in the basement of the house where I was living in. And I made it just for the heck of it and stuck it away someplace. And then when this costume event showed the use for it for the first time, I wore it at that event along with my broadsword.
Very cool. So did you fight in the first tournament at the first event?
Yes, I did. I had a couple of years previously, I had joined a fencing club in college and studied foil fencing for about a year. And I had always been interested in swords and stuff like that when I was in grammar school. And my first inclination to build anything came as a result of seeing the movie Prince Valiant when I was in 4th grade. And I immediately went to the local lumber yard and had them cut out a piece of plywood in the shape of a elongated heater shield. And I painted a device on it, and I made a sword out of a wooden rocking chair rocker, and went around and fought my fellow classmates, breaking their swords with my oak.
That's super cool. So I have to ask, did you stick with your original arms from your first heater shield?
No, that was just a cross, a red cross on a gray background. No, I was enamored of Prince Valiant because I had, before seeing the movie, I'd been listening. We didn't have television in those days, and so I would listen to the Saturday morning radio with kids programs, and Sunday morning. And one of the programs that was going on was reading of the Sunday Funnies, where they would have a person's emulate the speech of the different characters and the different comics. And one of the comics was Prince Valiant. And Hal Foster's Prince Valiant was So I would look at that, and they would read the lines of each scene. And then when I saw the movie, I was thoroughly hooked on knights in shining armor. So I always tried to find ways of attaining that environment, but there wasn't anything available other than movies of similar, like Ivanhoe and El Cid and The Warlord and things like that. And so those all interested me, but I didn't know anything about weapons and armor at the time. And then after I made a broadsword, which I happen to have right here.
Cool.
It's just mild steel, but and it weighs about 5 pounds. But I made a scabbard for it, and the only difference between this as it is now and what I had at the first tournament was the pommel was just a glove of brass that I was hoping to try and carve into a horse head shape, but never got that far. So later on, I took the old pommel off and then turned a new one, a more historically correct one. But that was my first sword. And since then, I made a few others and other weapons too.
Wow. So how did your participation evolve from the first tournament, first party to, I mean, you're still involved. How did it become, something that you focused on?
Well, I was majoring in engineering, so I was always interested in the concept of constructing stuff and learning how stuff work. And I like working with my hands and making things. And so this was just a venue for me to vent my inclinations to do anything and everything that was possible. And I was learning within the SCA slowly information about how weapons and armor and pavilions and clothing and all sorts of things that I had to do on my own because I couldn't afford to pay anybody to do it. And besides which, I was interested in learning how. So I just continued learning whenever there was an opportunity, joined forces with other people and collectively learning how to do stuff. I made my first pavilion was a circular conical top style pavilion with a rattan center pole and garden umbrella spoke interior frame to hold the roof out. And it was made out of a bunch of bed sheets my mom gave me. And I dyed them and added a dagged edge to the bottom of the top cone roof. And there are pictures of it on the website, but this is one here that I don't know if you can see it in there.
Oh yeah, definitely.
It's a black and white photo, but that was the first pavilion. And subsequently, it got destroyed in a house fire where it was being stored. And the only thing I managed to salvage was the center pole, which I turned into a great sword.
Someone wants to know how long it was before the SCA started looking more like what we know it as now. She says that by the time she joined in 1970, it was pretty well established. So that seems really quick.
Well, we had a lot of enthusiastic people, all contributing their own skills and interests and talents. Some people were costume people who had been doing costuming for science fiction, fantasy conventions before the SCA ever began. So some of those people just graduated into medieval costuming quite readily. And other people like myself made our own, again, because that was either the most economical, or for that matter, men's clothing wasn't as complex as ladies' clothing. So it was easier for people like me to do stuff.
Yeah, we get the short end of the stick in the complexity department. So somebody else wants to know how the first knighting came about, who decided it, what was it based upon, and then, you know, how did knighting become a thing?
Well, the first knighting happened at the first event, and that was Siegfried just being inspired by Ardril Argoferkais's ferocity in the field, using a mace and shield. And there wasn't really any armor. We were wearing fencing masks for head protection, leather gloves if we had them for hand protection, and simple shield for body protection. And nobody was really hitting very hard, because we realized if we hit with any of the weapons that we were using in a destructive manner, we could actually injure somebody because they weren't being protected by anything significant. And so the blows were softer, and the weapons, well, there were foils being used in normal fencing style. And so the fencing mask and just a cloth body covering was sufficient protection from that, because you had a padded tip. And there were sock maces that were basically a stick with rags wrapped around and covered with a sock tied off. The rags being padding between the stick and the outside. And so that you could, if you hit somebody hard, you might cause some injury. You might cave in the fencing mask or something like that. But and there were one or two swords, but they were thin wood, and they broke quite readily over the edge of the shield, and I don't think they lasted very long. The only sword of any significance that did do damage was one that I made a replica of for 50 year, which is made out of 3/4 inch thick oak.
Wow.
And is overall 2 feet long. And it ended up breaking the thumb of one of the fighters. And this was Duke Richard's sword. But that was the only weapon that had any significant damage potential, and he wasn't trying to break anybody's thumbs or fingers or anything like that. He just was an unlucky blow that the gentleman got hit. And even so, he continued fighting. And that was Deutsche Börsenschaft, who was originally proclaimed the winner, but then movies that had been 8mm movies that had been filmed of some of his fights showed that he'd gotten some body blows that he hadn't acknowledged. And so the victory was taken away from him, and he never came back to any event anyway. So it was sort of a moot issue whether or not it was appropriate to do so, because among other things, nobody had any structure at the point where it was decided that he wasn't the winner after all.
So fighting evolved into an honor-based, you know, the slain person calls their blow. How was that come to be, and not like a martial?
Well, it actually began at the very first event. We just fought and acknowledged blows to our body, and that just continued into a more formal process, but it was there from the beginning as far as I'm aware.
So you're getting a ton of questions. So I think I will just ask a couple of them, unless you want to go ahead, Ashak, do you want to ask some of them?
Go ahead.
So one person wants to know, you were very much part of the development of fighting in the beginning. What do you think of how fighting has changed over time?
Well, obviously it's gotten faster and more vigorous than it was at the very beginning. And the decision to use rattan as a weapons resource was probably the best that was available at the time. I often think, where would the SCA be today if modern European martial arts that have been developed in the last 15, 20 years, if that was available back then, and if the spring steel swords and armor and stuff like that that's available today, had that been available in 1966, where would we be today? It's unimaginable. But the choice of rattan made it economically feasible to outfit everybody with weapons that were relatively safe. And then the development of armor in I would consider it a bootstrap approach, where people found needs for protection and then developed means for doing so that were either using modern materials like hockey gloves and and things like that, or making historically accurate replicas such as plate finger gauntlets and articulated body armor and stuff like that, and helmets of good design and quality. All those, excuse me, all those things contributed to the evolution of the fighting styles that we have today. The only thing that that changed my mind as to the desirability of the fighting style that we see today was my initiation of having a cutting contest at a local tournament, old timers tournament is what we called it, in 1989, and where the object was to cut 2-liter bottles full of water that were suspended by a cord with a sharp blade of any size, shape, design, whatever. And it became apparent that some of the failings that we had noted, this is a sword that I made as a replica of what we're using at the second tournament in June of 1966, looking for a material that wouldn't break. And this is just flattened thin wall tubing, 1-inch diameter thin wall tubing. And we made some out of aluminum and we made some out of steel. And what was happening with these swords was they were bending in the flat. And we thought, oh, well, that's because it's inferior material. It's not spring steel. What we didn't realize at the time was, no, it was blade presentation and point of contact. And if you don't have the cutting edge relatively close to being perpendicular to the point where it makes contact with an object, it will cause a flat blade like that to rotate, and the energy will go into bending the blade sideways instead of in the direction of the plane of the cutting edges. And so what we found when we were chopping at 4-pound 2-liter bottles hanging from a cord, we're breaking pommels off of inferior quality swords. We're bending high quality blade steel blades, and rarely were we able to cut through the whole bottle. And that's just a thin sheet of or surrounding of plastic with flexible water inside. So if you put steel there instead of plastic, and you put something more rigid like bones covered by flesh, it's going to be even harder to cut through it. And so the type of fighting that the SCA has evolved into, in my estimation, is baton combat. It's not blade combat. And that's the only thing that I'm not so keen on about SCA fighting. And although people put tape along the edges of their swords to indicate where the cutting edge is, and many fighters try to keep from having blows that hit with the relative flat of the blade being counted, it's still impossible when you receive a blow to tell what part of the blade actually struck you So for you to call the blow yourself against yourself, tricky at best. And if you rely on observers to say, oh, well, that was with the cutting edge or that was with the flat of the blade, the blows are so rapid and the point of contact so short that you can't really tell in many cases whether it's really 10 degrees off or 2 degrees offline. And 10 degrees offline will cause a blade to rotate unless you have a really solid grip on the handle. And most people don't have that. They tend to hold the handle of the sword loose so that they have less muscle strain during the course of the combat to the point where they actually make contact. And you don't need to have a strong grip on the handle of a sword. You can have a loose grip until at the point where it makes contact. So in other words, for me, the love of fighting kind of evaporated when I realized that it was difficult to make a clear decision in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, more than I care for. And at the same time, about that time, I got married and started having a family. I have two children, and that drew my interest away from the SCA in general. Not to the point of exclusively avoiding the SCA, but I'd go to a few events, but I wouldn't compete as I had been when I was single and was first enamored of fighting.
Yeah, having a family definitely changes your priorities and your focus, and it should.
Yeah.
One of the things I thought was really cool when I was looking through the photos on the West Kingdom history site was how early you were doing equestrian in the SCA. Maybe I should bring up some of the photos. But someone also asked, how did you get into equestrian and writing? And was that something you were doing before the SCA and that you brought it in?
Oh, that was definitely doing it before the SCA. In San Francisco, back in the 50s and 60s, they had a thing called Playland at the Beach at the shoreward end of Golden Gate Park, where they had Ferris wheels and roller coasters and all sorts of amusement park activities, including pony rides. And so when I was a little kid and was living in San Francisco for a while, my mother would take me down there and I'd get to ride the ponies. And they had two varieties, one where the ponies were running free around a track and another where they were tethered to a spoked wheel and they just walk in a circle. So when I was younger, I would ride the wheel horses. And when I got a little bit bigger, then I'd ride the free running ponies. And then when I was in grammar school and summer camp, I'd occasionally go to a camp where they had horses available. So I'd ride during the summer months a little bit here and there. And then when I got into college, I was doing the same thing. There was near San Francisco State, there was several rental stables down on the beach that I could go and rent a horse for $3, $3.50 an hour and ride around there. So for me, riding a horse was something I'd done most of my life. And so doing it in armor was something I always wanted to do. So as soon as I built my first shirt of mail, I got on a horse and rode.
Maybe I'll bring up the pictures because they're super cool. Let me do that.
Another question that somebody had was the SCA kind of gives us all a sense of family, and they were wondering if that sense of family began with the first events. I mean, was there any immediate sense of bonding?
Well, from my point of view, not immediately, but not long after. The issue for me was I was living in Marin County, which is northeast across the bay from San Francisco, not northeast, north across the bay from San Francisco, and west the East Bay, where the majority of people who organized the first event lived. So they knew each other from being associated with science fiction fandom in the area. I didn't know them very much, if at all. And at the first event, I got introduced to them, but then when I started attending more events, then of course they became more familiar and then friendly, and then in some cases family. Yeah.
Awesome.
Okay. So
Now this picture here, this is probably 76, maybe 75, maybe 77, somewhere in that time frame. And what isn't really obvious, but there's a lady riding on the horse behind me. I'm wearing a cloak and she's sitting behind the cloak, but you can see her foot sticking out behind the cloak.
Sure.
And you can see a little bit of red of the surcoat that or tunic that she was wearing. And that was Mistress Cleven's shoe.
very cool.
But the first event that I rode a horse is the fourth tournament, March 25th, 1967, AS1. And this is the picture.
Oh, let me see.
If you look at me.
Yeah. Oh, very cool.
Wow.
And that's the first time I wore the shirt of the hauberk of mail that I'm wearing. And the horse belonged to a lady who was just riding through the park and stopped to ask, what were we doing? And I went over and asked her if I could try out my new armor on her horse. And she said, sure. And so the horse put up with me, and the lady was very generous and allowed me to ride. And I had a new helmet and a new shield and a borrowed spear from one of the other SCAers there.
Wow.
So that chainmail was probably steel, right? Not aluminum. It was probably very heavy.
It was made out of 550 coat hangers.
550 coat hangers. Very cool. Did you make it?
Yes, I did.
Wow. That's a lot of work.
I sat there hand turning rings on a mandrel while watching the first season of Star Trek.
Nice. Nice. Very
That makes me so happy.
Yeah.
That's so awesome.
That's just Mari wanted me to ask you, what did writing in chainmail teach you about chainmail? Describe what you were wearing. I suspect recent wearers are wearing very different mail these days. And you described that.
The rings were 1/2 inch inside diameter, probably 12 gauge wire. It weighed 40 pounds, and it was knee length and elbow length. And the skirt was flared out like a T-tunic. I added extra mail gussets in the sides from the hip down so that I'd have freedom of leg movement, which added more weight, but it made it easy to sit astride a horse. And of course, the skirt was slit front and back to allow the mail to hang down my legs while I was sitting in the saddle.
Very cool. Super cool. So should I go back to the pictures? Do you want to tell us what some of these are?
Sure.
Okay.
The one of me kneeling is that I'm wearing the same shirt of mail. And you can see the seam line where the triangles come together at the hip.
Yeah, that's cool.
And then I'm wearing splint leg armor. And I'm wearing the first helmet that I made, a Spangenhelm, which has no padding inside it. And I wore that for the first 10 years of fighting. And I happen to have it here with me if you want to.
Oh yeah, let me stop sharing and we'll look at it. Very cool.
Wow.
It's just the steel stopped halfway down the copper band, and so I had to add some leather padding to stiffen the copper. And I don't know how well you can see it, but
I can see it pretty well.
So a related question, somebody else asked, who was the first person that tried using propane and Freon tanks as helmets? How did that come about?
The very first helmet after my helmet was a barrel helm made out of probably 18 gauge, maybe 20 gauge steel. And in order to make that helmet, you needed to have access to a Beverly shear or some other kind of shear that could shear the sheet metal. And the Beverly shear seemed to be the most useful type of shear, but none of us had one. One of the guys had access to a heating and sheet metal shop that the guys allowed him to use the tools on weekends when they weren't doing business. And so he made a couple of barrel helms for himself and for loan. And so the first couple of years, that was about all the armor that we had was either somebody made their own helmet or they used a barrel helm. But the barrel helms were kind of cumbersome. They had thick foam padding that you just kind of stuffed your head into, and they were hot and sweaty, and the eye slots were so far away from your eyes that your peripheral vision wasn't real acute. And so one of the fighters thought that a Freon tank could be converted into a barrel helm. And so he tried it and it worked. There are apparently several different thicknesses of metal that are used in different grades of Freon containers. And he happened to have access to a bunch of empties. So he started making them and was selling them at very inexpensive cost to fighters that were interested in them. And so the Freon can helm became very common among the SCA. The Middle Kingdom, there was Polydor Haraldson, who wrote some articles on how to make armor. I think they concentrated on gauntlets, among other things, for the hands. In my case, I was at a fighting practice and broke some bones in my left hand, so I went and devised a basket hilt that basically you cut the tang of the rattan to fit inside the handle, which is a tube, and then you put a pommel on the bottom end with a lag screw going into the handle to secure it in place. And I wrote an article for TI on how to make one. And this is a replica that I made for 50th year.
Very cool. So you were the one that came up with the bar stock.
Basket helm.
Yeah, sorry. I fought today and my brain's like, woo. So very cool. I'm going to go back to the pictures.
Yeah.
Let me see. And we'll go to the next one. Very handsome man there.
Yeah, that's pretty early on. I'm not sure what year, but it might be year 1 or 2, maybe year 3.
That coat hanger chainmail looks amazing.
It really does.
Well, except for the camail on the helmet, I welded all the rings shut so I wouldn't have mail moth issues.
Wow. Wow.
And I estimate it took me about 250 hours to complete the shirt or the hauberk. Now that is me at the Battle of Hastings in 2000, in October 14th, 2000, and in England at Battle Abbey at the site of the Battle of Hastings. And the saddle I'm riding is one that I made, the first saddle I've ever made.
Wow.
Wow.
What a dream.
The horse I'm riding is King, a theatrical horse that happens to be the same horse that Mel Gibson rode in Braveheart.
Super cool. That's super cool.
Now that's another horse that's many years earlier. That I'm not sure what the location is. It might be the first overnight tournament. I'm not sure. I kind of don't think so, but it could be. And that's just a horse that belonged to a friend that I was allowed to ride. Now that's at the fourth tournament, the one that I won for the first time. And there I'm wearing the tabard that I mentioned I made in high school. And the pouch that's hanging on my hip is one of a pair that I made for a dog that I had using Nabisco shredded wheat, craft instructions for a character named Straight Arrow.
Wow.
And so I made that probably in 1955, 56. Yeah, maybe 1956. And then I'm using a flail that's made out of a wooden handle with a chain composed of leather links and a rubber ball with dart tips glued to on it to simulate spikes.
Wow. I would not want to get hit by that.
Well, it's just a sponge rubber ball.
Yeah.
It's not very heavy.
It's the dart tip, though.
Well, they're rubber darts.
Oh,
Suction.
Okay.
Okay.
No metal.
Okay. I just, my head went to metal and I was like, you guys were hardcore.
Yeah. I was trying to make something safe that looked realistic.
Okay.
The axe hand that's being wielded against me by Folk the Wyvern is made out of 3/4 inch plywood, solid. And he hit me in the side with it, and the haft was what contacted my body, and then he pulled back on it, and the bottom part of the blade caught on my tabard and tore the fabric.
Oh.
Yeah. I had to repair it. I repaired it and used it many years later for underneath my chainmail.
So you reigned as King of the West 6 times, right?
Yes.
And this would be your win for your first reign, is that right?
Yes. This was September 1966.
How long back then were reigns?
There were usually 3 per year, but they weren't spaced evenly. So, like for instance, I won that tournament. I was given a roll at the end of the day proclaiming me king, but it was a title with no substance to it, because during the subsequent months, October, November, December, January, February, and into March, I had no powers, but nobody necessarily thought that a king should have powers. And then during the winter months, some of us discussed that maybe I should have a coronation, and that means I needed to have a crown. So then I got together with Folk, the guy I was fighting in that photograph, and he and I came up with a design for the crown. And so then I constructed it and had it available at the March 67 tournament. And then right after I was riding on the horse, I was supposed to get crowned king. And so as I approached the dais to be crowned, Folk said to me, he was wearing the crown because he had won the tournament before the one I'd won. He said, no man should be king who is not a knight. And so then he knighted me. And that's how I got to be knighted, after displaying my prowess on horseback in armor.
Very cool. And were counts already a thing, and dukes? Like, was that already a thing back then?
No, not at all. Being king just meant that you got to sit out the next tournament.
Okay.
When they knighted you, did they use the ceremony that we use today, or no?
All he did was, as I just said, stated, no man should be king who is not a knight. Kneel. And then he pulled out his sword, and he had a nice Spanish two-hander, and he dubbed me knight. And then he crowned me.
Awesome.
So when
And
did the white belt come to be in the chain?
well, at the following tournament, another fighter was made proclaimed king, but they didn't have a crown for him, and nobody asked to borrow mine. And I'm not sure that mine would have fit him anyway, because my head is different shape than his, I believe. And in any case, then at the June tournament, he was reigning. This was Richard of Montroyal. And I won that June tournament. So then when the next tournament to come along was the September 67 tournament. I was then crowned king for the second time, and I had a different lady, so she was my queen. And then at the tournament that my successor was chosen, which was that tournament when I was crowned, I knighted him that evening, and that was William the Silent. So William the Silent is the one who created dukes, created the Order of Chivalry and the Order of the Laurel and the Order of Masters of as a branch of the Order of Chivalry, Masters of Arms. And so there were 12 of us at the end of the 12th night that were belted. Ardril, myself, William, and then the various others, Siegfried and Folk de Weveren, and Karl von Macht, and Stefan McHenrik, and Jamie Oakenshield. And I'm sure there's others that I've forgotten.
You remembered a lot. I don't know if I could remember that many.
I wouldn't.
No.
But basically, the Order of Chivalry branched in two directions, from Sir Argyl's knighting and my knighting. Sir Argyl went back east and knighted Bruce of Cloves and started the East Kingdom's chivalry through Bruce. And I knighted William the Silent, who knighted all the Western fighters that he knighted a 12th knight. And from that lineage, other Western knights developed. And I don't know, I know Atenveld's knights came from the West or Western lineage, and I don't know where Eastern knights are, where Middle Kingdom knights came from. Possibly some from Bruce of Cloves' line, and possibly some from the West Kingdom. I know that I can't think of his name now. There's a knight from either the Middle or the East who came out West and was knighted out here. And he was king at the time, as I recall, of either the Middle or the East. I don't remember which.
Somebody was asking about your involvement in the development of Atenveld.
Well, I went down for their first coronet tournament and was part of the entourage of King Stefan de Louvain and Queen Louise of the Phoenix, who went down as King and Queen of the West to oversee their first coronet tournament. And there I met a bunch of people from Atenveld and was encouraged to go and return. Then when Jean de la Grandance was King of the West a couple of years later, Adenbelt had grown to the point where it was exceeding the status of principality and was going to become its own kingdom. And I was King Jean's emissary and took the crown that became the Adenbelt crown to them. Theoretically, actually, it was created in Adenbelt and brought up, I think, for our 12th night just to show it off. And it looks sort of like the crown you see in that I Can't Believe It's Not Butter commercial. It with pearls glued on all over the place, that the glue wasn't strong enough to keep them all in place. And so as it was transported back and forth, it continued losing pearls.
Oh no.
In any case, Richard Ironsteed was the winner of the first crown tournament. And I presented him with the crown that he had basically brought up to the West to show off. And then he crowned himself and then crowned his lady, Felicia Nick Lorraine. And that was the beginning of the Kingdom of Adenbelt. And so
the tradition of crowning themselves.
Yeah.
Cool. So somebody's saying that Cariadoc was the guy that started the Middle Knights.
That could well be, but he, I think, was king of the East before he became king of the Middle. And so I don't know if he is of the lineage of Bruce of Cloves. It would seem likely, but I'm not sure.
Cool. That's super cool. So you're also a member of the Laurel and a member of the Pelican. And I mean, just you describing how you made your chainmail and blows me away. But do you have a specialty for your Laurel? Like, was there something you were laureled for?
Well, not that I'm aware of. I was offered the Laurel and the Pelican at the same time, and by King Kevin Peregrine, King Kevin Peregrine, and Queen oh Jesus. Now I can't remember her name. I remember her. Oh, Patrice de Cour Fidel. Yeah. Anyway, I was offered the Laurel and the Pelican, and I said yes and no. I said yes to the Laurel because I figured I was handy with my hands and made a lot of stuff, but I didn't feel that that I was worthy of that, so I declined that. And I didn't realize that two other peers had similarly declined offers of, I believe, it was a Pelican, and King Kevin wasn't really pleased with that. So when I was offered it again, he stood at my back almost at sword's point to make me change my mind if I didn't say yes.
Did you say, yes, I'm the king's man?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Oh, that's funny. So what are some of the other things that you helped develop as traditions in the West in your 6 reigns?
Well, I think possibly wars. I was the autocrat for the first war. There was in Marin County, which I mentioned is where I lived. There are several reservoirs that are used for water, drinking water for the county. And one of them was constructed while I was in high school. And so I had a particular affinity for that one because one of my classmates was studying biology, and he had a collection of snakes that he needed to feed. And when they built this reservoir, when they dammed up the creek, it forced the waters to rise and drove the toads that lived in the water along the shoreline in vast carpets of toads that are about 2 inches long. And so we would go out there with 5-gallon buckets and scoop him up and take him home to feed his snake. Uh, one of the things about the island, or I mean about the reservoir, is there was an island that had a land bridge that connected it to the shore. So you could drive out there, and there's some big, massive rocks like you might see in Scotland. And you've got scraggly oaks that are wind beaten by the dominant wind and weather that's out there. And it was cattle country where dairy cattle were being grazed. And it just looked real forlorn and wild and wilderness like, but yet was easy to drive to. And so I thought it would be interesting to have a war. And so we got a dozen fighters, which was remarkable that we could get enough armor to get a dozen guys together, and got them to go out there. And we divided into 2 armies of 6 men each and proceeded to traipse around the country side out there and climb up on one of the big rocks that was kind of like a giant cube that was about 15 feet high and 15 feet wide, and had overhang on one side with poison oak and a steep incline on the other side that you could manage to scrabble up. And I went up there with a big heavy steel spike and drove it into a crack in the rock where it's still there today, I believe. You could tie off some ropes and climb up more readily with that as an aid. And so we went out there, and although it was like a half-mile walk to get out to the island, it was still fun. And the following year we did it again, and we had more people. And so I said, well, we don't have much more armor, but if we have bows and arrows, we can get kids and girls to participate and increase the size of the armies. And just make sure that the bows are weak, the arrows are short, and they're well padded, and everybody's got face protection that screens the arrows so you don't get an arrow in the eye. And we did that, and we did it for 10 years.
Wow. At the same site?
Same site, yeah. It wasn't a real popular site because you had to carry everything with you out there, including food and water. And there weren't any bathrooms or anything. There was a porta potty out near the highway. So if you were in dire straits, you could use that. But there are a lot of trees and bushes. There are deer on the island. There's, according to Siegfried, he said he saw a bear run past him. I never saw it, but he claimed it was a bear. So maybe there was a bear out there. I don't know.
Wow. Shaxi, did you have something that looked like you were writing down something?
No, I just am fidgety, so I got something out to write down.
Okay. Well, a couple people were asking about when buffets became part of the knighting ceremony, and I think I recall when we talked to Deaton that he said maybe with Sir Trudy's knighting. Is that your recollection?
I don't recall that I was at Sir Trudy's knighting. It was in Atenveld. And although I went to a lot of their events, I didn't go to all their events because it's a 12-hour
long way. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have a different recollection of the buffet though?
I believe it came to the West sometime after I stopped being really active. So I would guess probably sometime after the early 80s. Because I know in the beginning we never had anything like that. We didn't even have vigils for that matter. That became popular probably more in the late 70s, mid to late 70s.
Do you remember when the Lord of the Rings knighting ceremony became sort of the standard? I love it, but
I don't.
No.
I don't know. I'm not even sure I know what the Lord of the Rings knighting ceremony is. I know that there was a choreography for the 12th night that William created, the first dozen or so nights. And it's somewhere in the history site. A copy of the document is, the wording is there. And it may be that it dates back to that time frame. I know Siegfried was one of the major authors of the ceremonies for that first 12th night and the knighting ceremony, as well as being the first person to create a knight at the first tournament. So he would be the best person to ask about it, I think.
Okay.
Very cool.
Yeah, definitely.
So you said that you had 2 children. Did they ever express an interest in doing this crazy thing? Did they ever come along and play?
Well, we brought him along when we were young and couldn't be left home alone. My son is more active. We generally go down to Estrella War, and that's about the only time that he's really active. And he's gotten into a household of young folks down there, and they camp together and mostly do non-fighting stuff, but they do some fighting too. He and I have done a few practice rounds now and then.
Very cool.
Yes.
And
he mostly doesn't do SCA stuff, though occasionally there might be some reason to do something. She does have various costume elements and stuff like that, so she can attend whenever she feels like it. And that's one of the nice things about the SCA is you don't need to be a member in order to go and hang out and do stuff. If you want to be an officer, maybe that's a different issue. If you want to get newsletter, that's a different issue. But if you just want to go and hang out with friends, and we become practically family with several people in Belt that we go out and hang out with just about every time we can, and we go there for Thanksgiving most years as well. This year we didn't, but at least we did a little Skyping with them.
awesome. That's great.
And they've got a couple boys that are my kids' ages, so the boys do a lot of stuff together. My son and Duke Arthur of Lockhaven's son go to Comic-Con with me.
So you're still involved in the science fiction and the con community as well?
No, not really. I pretty much got out of that when I got into the SCA. But Comic-Con, that's a different phenomenon. That's a lot of studio promotions. You get to see fun entertainments like the Vikings cast. I met a bunch of them at several of the Comic-Cons. I met Noel Neal, the old Superman TV series Lois Lane. I met some of the Star Trek Next Generation cast members. People like that you can meet at Comic-Con. So that interests me. And then the science aspect of it also interests me. I've been to Alien Con, the first one that they had in Pasadena, because I was interested in hearing more about the science aspect of what they were presenting.
Very cool.
So go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, somebody else asked sort of a related question about how the SCA has evolved from sort of this offshoot of the science fiction con community into sort of a direction of more authenticity. And what was your viewpoint on that?
Well, I've always been interested in the reality aspect of it. And in fact, I was just reading something in the history site about the term, the dream. And I reread comments that I made to the history site about that term. Basically, my interest is in reality. I'm interested in history. I'm interested in how things work, how they were created, how they were produced, how they were implemented, how they were used, what kind of effect they had. And so for me, getting on a horse in armor is something that interests me much more than going out and hitting somebody with a rattan stick. And whatever I can manage to do on horseback in armor is great. And that's one of the reasons why I went to the Battle of Hastings reenactment, because there I got to ride with 100 other riders in armor against 1,000 fighters on foot, which you can't do in the SCA, unfortunately. I was at 50 year and there was 107 of us on horseback in the grand procession, but it was a grand procession, it wasn't a battle. And when you get into a battle situation and see stuff like another horse and rider galloping down the hill, the horse tripping and falling, doing a somersault, rolling over the rider. And as I look in the front of my horse falling behind to see if he's going to trip over something, and I look back over and the horse is standing on 4 feet, the rider is standing next to him, and 5 minutes later he's in the saddle galloping along as if nothing had happened. That's amazing.
It is amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if in America with our litigious nature, if we could do something like that. I'm not sure.
Certainly it was a surprise that A, it happened, and B, that nobody got significantly injured. He could have just easily been dead. One of the witnesses from down below the hill looking up, who said he saw the same fall, said that the cantle of the horse rolled across the guy's kite shield, which was covering his body. And if that hadn't been there, the horse's weight might have crushed his ribs or whatever, and could well have killed him. So I was lucky that he had a good shield where he did when it happened. I saw another horse charge against the shield wall. The guy who was riding that horse said that his horse was a polo pony that he trained to charge into a shield wall, and the horse put his nose up in the air and lunged forward, so his chest hit the guy's shield that he was lunging against, knocked him backwards, who knocked into the guy behind him and knocked him to the ground, and created a fuss because nobody was expecting it. But
a little scary to have a big horse come down on you. Thanks.
Definitely.
Wow. What was I going to say? Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to go back to the master question that we didn't really ask. We sort of touched on it, but somebody here says, if I may ask a more pie question, as later generations of the chivalry would call it, but what are your thoughts on the relationship between knights and masters of arms, especially as the lineage of both emerges from the first event and the roles formalized not 2 years later? Was there beef, or did that emerge later?
Was there beef? I'm not sure.
I think they mean contention.
Yeah, I think that's what they mean.
Oh, I'm not sure that there was any particular tension. There were some people that liked the idea, some people that didn't like the idea, but I think it was relatively reasonably accepted by the people that were affected by it here in the West. I don't know how other kingdoms felt about it if and when it might have affected their structure.
It's interesting because I don't want to linger on masters, but the Western Rite kingdoms, there seems to be a very small percentage of masters, and that's not the case on the East. It's interesting how they developed in parallel, but different. It's just a observation.
I know that many people in Atenveld thought taking rank of master as opposed to a knight was in a sense a put down on the board of directors that were at the time focused in the West Kingdom, in terms of they apparently felt that the West was trying to throw its weight around and govern how Eight Belt developed more from a power play point of view than anything else. And I don't think that was ever the case. But, you know, perceptions at the local level can easily be influenced by all sorts of things that none of us out here were privy to.
It's kind of astonishing, right? I mean, you have this first party in a backyard in 66, and you know, by the mid 70s it's everywhere. And were you sort of blown away by how much it took off?
Yes, very frankly, I was. One of the things that astonished me was the fact that here a bunch of strangers could become family. And I think that alludes back to your earlier question, that there was in my estimation, a strong degree of family-like relationship amongst everybody. The idea that you could be honorable, that you could do good for the sake of doing good, as opposed to doing good for the sake of trying to escape punishment, I think was remarkable at the time. And I always felt that the SCA was a place where you could leave your front door open, if you will, and not worry about somebody wandering into your pavilion and stealing your blind and stuff like that. Where in the real world, you couldn't do that. You got to lock your gates and lock your doors and gird yourself against the evil that exists in the world. And you look at society today, and it's not real swift out there. And there's a certain level of refuge that the SCA offers and has offered, even with the few scalawags that the SCA has occasionally encountered.
Yeah, it is a very unique organization in the way that people trust each other and are so generous and open with each other. And you get the bad scalawag every once in a while. It seems like the last couple of years we've had some very notable ones. But you know, you can basically go almost anywhere in the world and, you know, somebody will open their door to you. And that is incredible.
Yeah, it is.
And people spend lifetimes with it. I mean, you've been doing this for over 50 years.
Yep.
And my sister and I are at about 25 years at this point.
Yeah. It's just, you know, it's weird, right? Because you don't, when you first start, I'm sure when you first started, I didn't think this would be something I was doing for decades. But there's so many aspects of the SCA that it feeds your artistic need, it feeds your sort of need to do and do things, and it feeds my need to, you know, be involved in a sport or a martial art. So, and all my friends are there, you know. It's very interesting, the way that there's just so much to do, and it can feed every aspect of your personality.
I agree. I think that the fact that there's so many resources that are available, and over the years, as the population has grown in number and the skills of individuals have improved, the sharing that goes on, collegiums and things like that are relatively unique. I mean, I've gone to Caid to attend an arrowhead making workshop where we were actually forging arrowheads in the class. And I've taken shoe making classes. I've taken armor making classes. I found a local blacksmith who taught me how to make Viking axes. there are all sorts of opportunities that either you learn directly through the SCA or you get a reference from the SCA where you can go find something that is specific. I've smelted iron from iron ore, not completely on my own, but I've assisted in the process, building of the kiln and then doing the smelt that took 6 hours to get a 40-pound bloom of wrought iron that could then be forged into something. And seeing those things and experiencing those things and learning about them, I think is a unique feature that the SCA has fostered, if not directly provided, complete ability and access to.
For sure, for sure. What are some things that you're still wanting to do? What's kind of keeping you around? What are your goals?
Mostly now I go to find merchants that are selling cool stuff. Sometimes it's a blade, sometimes it's wool. Like the tunic I'm wearing is a wool that came from Europe. It's woad dyed. The braid I put on the sleeves and the neck and the hem was some card woven trim that I bought at Trelleborg Viking Market in Denmark a couple of years ago. And not everybody is in the SCA. Many of the people that I encounter are reenactors that do historical reenactments, and Viking age is an age that interests me a lot because of the simplicity, the beauty of the artifacts and the designs. And of course, there's Viking ships, which I'm enamored of and would love to have access to, but don't over here. And although I've got plenty of San Francisco Bay waters and Delta waters, that would be great for rowing a Viking ship around in and sailing. And one day, maybe I hope somebody will have one here. But at least when I was in Denmark 2 years ago, I went sailing on one of the replica Viking ships at the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde. And I got to see their sea stallion, which I saw in 2004, just after they built it. And now it's been to Dublin, sailed to Dublin and back, and goes out on annual summer 2-week outings. And when I was there, they were just launching it for their then current outing event. And they've done experiments with rowing. The ship is 30 meters long and has 60 oars, 30 on a side. And they've experimented with having all the oars being rowed at the same time, as opposed to every other oar being rowed and every other seat being slack. And they can make almost as much speed with half the oars pulling fuller strokes, because you only have 30 inches between each bench. And so you can only pull about 30 inches of a stroke. But if you've got an empty bench in front of you and behind you, you can reach out further and pull back, lean back further and get maybe 60 inches of a stroke. So with half the rowers resting and half the rowers rowing, they can alternate every half hour and maintain a speed. I think it's maybe 7.5 knots or something like that for consistently long periods, several hours, maybe a whole day. Where if they have everybody rowing, they tucker out after about 45 minutes, then have to stop. So those are things that the SCA isn't doing yet, but maybe one day.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we even have cut and thrust now, which, might feed your need for a more authentic blade fighting.
Yeah.
Has your interest in the Scandinavian and Viking age stuff, is that something that you've had from the start?
Not really, but again, my initial interest focused on Prince Valiant. And
Right.
Prince Valiant, is supposedly Viking age, even though King Arthur was 300 or 400 years before the Viking Age. The Viking Age, basically the late 700s through the middle of or the end of the 11th century. But you have the Vendel period preceding the Viking Age, and there's a lot of new archaeological discoveries occurring in the Eastern Baltic area there, where you're getting a transition from the Vendel period into the Viking period, and you're seeing stuff from the early 700s and maybe even late 600s in that area. And who knows what they'll find.
It's fascinating.
It is. It's super fascinating.
So exciting.
An area that I'm very interested in, and the finds have been so interesting in the last 5 years.
Yeah.
So, very cool. Do you want to do final 10?
Yeah, I can, unless somebody in the audience has a pressing question that they would like to ask His Grace, we will transition into the final 10, because he's shown us quite a few swords tonight, so I don't think we need to go over that. By the way, thank you so much for bringing the replica swords and the pictures, and that was just phenomenal.
Sure, you're welcome.
I really appreciate it. Okay. So the final 10, is there any that you have never gone to that you would like to go to?
Say that again. I didn't catch. There was a word. Can you repeat?
Oh, event that you have never gone to that you would like to go to.
Did you catch that? She's really choppy. Is there an event that you haven't been able to go to that you would like to go to?
I'd say Gulf Wars. I've been to Pennsic several times. I've been to Lily's once. I've been to Adenvelt's Estrella War a lot of times, and Great Western War in Southern California a bunch of times. I think Gulf Wars is something I've never attended, and apparently they have a lot of equestrian stuff there.
Am I still choppy?
You're better now.
Okay. I'm sure it's because my husband is playing video games and my daughter's playing video games and everybody's using the internet. But I will just tell me if I'm choppy. Like, don't Aishaxi, raise your hand and maybe you can ask the questions.
Okay.
What book do you think everyone on the path to knighthood should read?
I'm not sure I can answer that because my tendency to read books varies quite a bit. I collect Japanese swords. I've been doing that for 40 plus years. I am interested in some of the new developments with the jousting, the balsa wood jousting. I never got a chance to actually do balsa wood jousting, although I got close to it. I just never got to the point. Now my hips are plagued with arthritis, and the last time I rode a horse, it was very uncomfortable. So I'm not sure I'll ever get to do that. Some of the period translations of period manuscripts that I've seen, Fiore, among others, present interesting things I hadn't thought about from an equestrian perspective. For instance, I have my own philosophy about the physics of jousting. And basically, when you're jousting against a person, you're jousting across the body. And so you couch the lance underneath your right arm, and you can lean it against the edge of your shield as you aim towards your opponent coming from the left or shield side. And that gives you 2 points of contact to help steady the lance. But if your opponent is on the right side coming at you, you only have the arm, the right arm pit holding and the hand holding the lance, and it's a much weaker position. But Fiore says couch it under the shield arm pit, and then hold the right hand in front. And then you have 2 points of contact again with the body. And it's much stronger than under the right arm. And I never thought of that until I saw it in Fury's work. So there's constantly new stuff that's out there to be found, and any one resource, I can't imagine what I could recommend.
Okay. Somebody else asked, and I'll just substitute this in. What do you think we lost from the start of the SCA to now?
Innocence.
And then a follow-up question to that would be, if you could change one thing about the current SCA, what would it be?
You know, I don't think I would want to change anything, because the SCA is evolved to where it is today due to the needs of the people that are in it today. And although I might have preferences as to fighting styles or clothing fashions or encampment organizations or event organizations or anything like that, one person's opinion isn't any more valid than another person's. And I would say the SCA is probably where it's supposed to be. The fact that we were able to provide input or context for as many people of so many different varied interests and activities that have blossomed on their own, to the point where they've drawn many people away from the SCA because of the politics or something else that the SCA might have a little too much of here or there. I don't think that matters. I think that the SCA provided a breeding ground for the various traditions that have evolved. You've got Western martial arts activities going on today that I'm sure the SCA has contributed some degree of fertilization for. You've got hard suit fighters that use steel blades, like Battle of Nations and stuff like that, that didn't exist 50 years ago, that exist today, that some SCAers are drawn to. And you've got rapier fencers today that didn't exist 50 years ago, that and side sword fighting, and all these different things that have developed over the time, much of which the SCA was a fertilized catalyst towards, in to some degree. I'm not sure how much, but I see SCAers doing all sorts of stuff.
Do you have a favorite story from attending a Pennsic or an Estrella?
Yeah, I went to Estrella War for many years in a row. It started out, I went to Burrow Creek once or twice. I went to Estrella Mountain Park a whole bunch of times. I liked the fact that they had horses at Estrella Mountain Park, had an arena nearby that we could ride horses at. And I went to that site next to or nearby the prison. I went, then they went back to Estrella Mountain Park, and I remember there was 3 armies. I think the Volunteer and elements from the Northeast provided one army of about 1,300 men. Adenveld provided an army of 1,300 men, and the Western forces another 1,300 men. They had 3 armies of almost 4,000 fighters there. And I remember being on top of the giant hay bale pile with the commander of the Aten forces, and I wish I could find the videotape that I filmed, and I could see all these couriers coming from different groups saying, well, so-and-so's group of so many men is over here. And the commander said, well, move them over there and get them to do this and do that. And I thought, and also that was when I first noticed that the Freon can helmets had disappeared, and barrel helms and close helms and bassinets and all sorts of period looking helmets and armor. There was one fluted Maximilian suit of armor that one guy had there that was gorgeous. And it was full body Maximilian plate armor. And I said to myself, wow, this is really fabulous.
There's a guy in Kaid that has a full set of Maximilian fluted armor, and it's just incredible. Super incredible. If you could fight anyone in the world, who would it be?
Prince Valiant.
I should have known. Do you have people that you like to watch fight currently?
Well, Paula Bellatrix has always been a favorite of mine. He's a very graceful and powerful fighter. And his philosophy of fighting and techniques of fighting, I've always thought were wonderful.
Yeah. Do you have someone that you look up to or admire in the SCA? And if so, who is it?
Well, probably my brother-in-arms, Duke Arthur of Lockhaven of Aytenvelt. I've known him since I first met him in 69 or 70.
Wow.
That's 50 plus years.
That's amazing.
I was at his wedding.
Cool.
And he just celebrated 50 years.
Wow. What is your favorite Western Kingdom tradition?
Well, one of my favorites was, it's no longer current, was a Grand March. We used to have everybody that was attending an event come up and present themselves to the crown. And those who were armigerous would be announced, and those who, by the heralds, and those who weren't would frequently just announce themselves. But it gave them a chance to be a participant as much as anybody else. And it also gave everybody a chance to see who was there and what outfits they were wearing and who they were hanging out with and stuff like that. And I thought that was a great opportunity for everybody to be included. And it's unfortunate that grand marches have been eliminated, mostly because it supposedly takes too long. We had an old timers tourney where we had 5 heralds announcing 5 lines of attendees, and it ran pretty quickly when you have everybody going one right after the other, instead of waiting for one person to clear out of the way and the next person to go up in the herald to then speak for him. When you have 5 heralds and 5 lines, then you can shorten the time quite a bit. And
I love the idea of multiple lines. If I ever reign, I think maybe our grand processional before crown will have multiple lines.
That would be great.
Yeah, I love that idea. It does. It takes a very long time because we still in our kingdom do a grand processional before crown, and we usually have between 70 and 110 participants, and with one line it takes a very, very long time.
Yeah.
Okay, last question. What do you think is the most important trait to be a successful peer?
Well, I would say treat everybody with kindness regardless of their status. You know, treat everybody equally. Basically do unto others as you'd have them do unto you.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. Well, Your Grace, thank you so much for talking to us and bringing all the historic artifacts, and that was just so much fun. It super was. So, and I really appreciate you doing this for us, even though I had to like sort of go through a couple people to find you. So, and trusting us to interview you and talk to you. I really do appreciate that.
Thank you so much.
Well, you're welcome. I enjoyed it, and I'm glad you were able to find me.
Yeah, me too. You have Christopher Houghton to thank for that. He, when I interviewed him, he said, you have to interview Henrik. And I said, I will do my best to find him and do it. So, yeah.
Here we are.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much. Tomorrow night, I am interviewing Duke Quilliam of the Kingdom of Eldermere. That will be very interesting. He was like an 18-year-old king, and he worked very, very hard to be a crown contender at a very young age. So it should be very interesting.
Oh, great.
So, thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.
And I hope to meet you personally after everything clears, everybody's cured of COVID-19 and all that baloney. It would be great to meet.
I would love that. I would love to come down to a Western Crown or an Estrella and meet up and see you in person.
That would be awesome.
All right.
All right.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.